secularists. I have to bombardments of stuff of this kind comes at me all the time. I don't go out and burn down the nearest mosque because I've been offended, do I? Don't be ridiculous. But I'm supposed to respect those who do such things. I'm supposed to treat them with an extra delicacy. Why should I be doing that? Who's the offended one here, really? I'm not going to make a big point about my feelings being hurt. I have a thick skin, I have a broad back, I've studied Socrates, I think the Socratic method's more convincing. But you act as if I'm the one who's offending them by saying, I find your beliefs actually rather unconvincing. And in any case, I'm not going to have them forced on me. Now, is that finally clear? Is it? I hope so. And how I'm never going to be told again by the Roman Catholic Church that I wouldn't know good from evil if it wasn't for them. I'm sorry. I'm never going to hear that again.
So, where I think we're in agreement is that we're seeking for a kind of tolerant humanism that can respect certain kinds of diversity, not any kind of diversity, but seriously grounded diversity and difference. And I see the foundation of that as provided by respect for individuals as autonomous centers of created life, if you like. And I suppose my question most basically
Excuse me, did you say autonomous centers of created life?
Created life, yeah. Which is also itself part of an ongoing creation, I think. But I suppose my question, very simply, to Christopher would be this. What does he think grounds the values of human dignity, respect, human value, and so on, if not the kind of theological foundation that I suggested?
Well, first I think a fairly unsentimental realism, which would consist at the minimum of a recognition that we're not created, that we are evolved, and that we are in fact identifiable members of a primate species with kinship with other animals. Some people don't like to believe this, or think it would be unpleasant if it was true, but it just is. So we may as well deal with that. I am generally tolerant. I love to teach arguments. I like to take part in arguments, but in this case there is no argument about creationism versus evolution. It's over. It's been over since a debate at the Natural History Museum in this university in the mid-19th century. The basis further for our morality, why is it that we think of others? Why do we care for them? I think is equally simple, if you like. Just as religion is preached to the simple and doesn't require a great superstructure of theology, the principles are essentially, I would even say, simplistic, but we have such a thing as human solidarity. If we didn't have it, we wouldn't have got this far. The usual statement of the nearest statement we can make of the moral absolute, the best approximation we've come up with is what's called the Golden Rule. It's variously stated, but it's usually rendered as something like, don't do to others what you would not wish them to do to you. This, of course, makes it difficult to pass judgment on people like Charles Manson or Adolf Hitler. It's open to the charge that it's only as good as the person making it. That's why I have a difficulty with the idea of moral absolutes, but it's a pretty good approximation. There's no society ever been discovered that doesn't have some such principle. If you tell me that my grandmother's Jewish ancestors got as far as Sinai not knowing that murder and theft and perjury were bad, and only then found out, I will say to you, they wouldn't have got that far if they'd been under another impression. There has been no revelation of this. It doesn't come from on high. It's innate. It's one of the things that makes up for being a primate. If there are some people who don't have it, but we call them psychopathic. And we have to reason it. If Jesus and Muhammad and Abraham and Moses had never been born, which in any case I tend to doubt, or if all the stories told about them were untrue, if that was suddenly to be found and everyone had to admit it, some people I know would go into a panic. Now what will we do? We have no morals suddenly. What could be more nonsensical than that? As a matter of fact, the position we occupy would be precisely the same as it is now. If none of these texts had ever been written, if none of these supposed utterances had ever been made, we would still have to reason together about how to treat one another, about how to build a just city, and about how to have irony and a sense of humor. So that's my answer. And I think the idea that there's a supernatural dictatorship required for us to think about our duties and responsibilities to each other is the most sinister idea ever invented. These questions cannot be referred up to a celestial dear leader. We do not live and do not wish to live, fortunately in any case don't have to live, in a divine North Korea. Thank you.
Mr. Hitchens, your turn.
Already. I quite deliberately didn't ask myself earlier what I was going to ask, and I'm not even completely sure now, out of a target-rich environment of stuff that I took from your remarks, Professor Haldane. I think what I'd like to ask you is this, and don't think of it as ad hominem, please. Would you really prefer me to be a Wahhabi Muslim or an Orthodox Jew or a Jesuit? Do you think I'd be a better person? Do you wish there were more Orthodox Jews, Wahhabi Muslims, and Jesuits, and fewer people like me? And if there were, do you think the world would be a more moral place? Seriously.
Well, I don't know whether the particular classes were chosen with some.
I could add to
some
the potential
sinister
classes.
intent.
I could add to the phylae, if you wish.
Yeah. I've no reason to think that simply by matter of some creedal affiliation that people would be any better or worse. And I think in that respect it is important, perhaps I should make this clear in case the point had been missed. It's no part of anything that I've said so far that the content of morality derives from some set of divine commands. I mean, you spoke about the idea...
It's not.
No. You spoke about the idea of some sort of supernatural dictatorship or something of that sort. What I was talking about were the grounds of value, not the idea that these... If you take, for example, you mentioned the golden rule, right? Treat others as you would have them treat you, which is one of the formulations, effectively, of Kant's categorical imperative, another one of which is treat others not merely as means, but always as ends. Now, both of those formulations, the interesting thing is if you ask the question, who are others in this respect, right? This principle has to be applied. When you say treat others, it doesn't include pieces of furniture, right? So the question is, who gets in to the constituency of that? And my suggestion is this, that when one starts to probe the question of who the other is in this respect, what comes forward is an idea of a person, the person, as a kind of site and locus of a certain kind of inviolable value. And my question, not to you, but I mean the question I'm inviting others to discuss is this: what could explain the existence of centers of inviolable value? Now, here's one answer to that. The transference by a creator of a certain kind of value that's attached to that deity itself onto others whom he chooses to extend as part of a certain kind of community of his own. And by the way, the community of his own here is not in the sense of a covenanted community or some set of people is against another set of people. This is all people. So nothing of what I had to say was to do with the idea that morality comes in the form of divine commands, but that rather the condition or the possibility of morality is that there be special kinds of beings in the world that nature itself doesn't account for.
Good. All right, well, I have my own questions for you.
Christopher Hitchens' point is that morality does not need religion to exist. Humans were not handed empathy from a church or a holy book. We evolved as social beings, and survival depended on cooperation, trust, and care for others. That lines up with what scientists call social evolution. Groups that cooperate have a better chance of surviving. Hitchens also points to the Golden Rule, which appears across many cultures, not only Christianity. Even the Bible records it in Matthew 7:12, but the idea is older and wider than one faith tradition. His argument is simple. If every religious story disappeared tomorrow, people would still need to reason together about fairness, harm, justice, and how to treat one another.
First, from Mr. Hitchens. How can your perspective, part of what we're talking about tonight is providing common ground for our public deliberations. And how can your perspective, especially...
Yeah, let's not overdo that.
Right. That's right. Let's be tasteful. Yeah. How can your perspective provide that kind of common ground if it dismisses a large majority of the population as irrational, as stuck in what you call in your book, the infancy of our race. I mean, doesn't that remove any room or incentive for people to try to reason together?
Not at all. I mean, religion is a private matter, in my opinion. I phrase it like this in my book. I just say, if you think that there's a creator who's made you specially and who watches over you and supervises you, who cares about you and wants you to do well and even wants you to survive death, I have to say, I think it's a preposterous proposition, because I have to be honest, and an irrational one, and a fatuous one, and a sinister one, because the idea of wanting a father who never dies and won't quit is infantilizing. But suppose you did think that, shouldn't it make you happy? It doesn't make them happy. It doesn't make them better at all. They won't be happy till I believe it too. So the first principle is, separate that. Keep it to yourselves. Go to any church you like. Build any church you want. Do it with your own money. Don't ask the government to teach this stuff to my children in a government school. We won't have that. And surely, in other words, I don't, when I'm offended by a filthy article I read about atheists and Jews and secularists, I have to, bombardments of stuff of this kind comes at me all the time. I don't go out and burn down the nearest mosque because I've been offended, do I? Don't be ridiculous. But I'm supposed to respect those who do such things. I'm supposed to treat them with an extra delicacy. Why should I be doing that? Who's the offended one here, really? I'm not going to make a big point about my feelings being hurt. I have a thick skin, I have a broad back, I've studied Socrates, I think the Socratic method's more convincing. But you act as if I'm the one who's offending them by saying, I find your beliefs actually rather unconvincing. And in any case, I'm not going to have them forced on me. Now, is that finally clear? Is it? I hope so. Good.
Well, Professor Haldane, someone might have a similar worry in terms of fairness about your own views. So you think that a lot of the moral norms and principles that we base even some of our policies on, so inviolability of the innocent and so on, are dependent on theological claims. But if we base political decisions on Christian ideas at all, isn't it unfair to impose those decisions on non-Christians who can't accept their rationale? I mean, especially if there are non-theological arguments to make the same points.
Well, look, I mean, what I'm suggesting is this is a kind of two-stage process here. First of all, what I think is extremely important, and this I agree ought to be a matter of common agreement, at least if not universal agreement, wide agreement between us, is that it is very important to fashion some basis, to identify some basis of common shared values beyond the merely procedural values that I made reference to. Because matters of mere procedural fairness are not going to get us through to the deeper questions. So then the question is, on what basis does one do that? Now, I think that, and here actually, again, I think there should be an area of agreement. I think that, for example, the thinkers of the Enlightenment who emphasized the importance of autonomy, of self-direction, of lives lived from the inside, if I can put it that way, rather than order imposed from the outside, I think identified something very important. But I think we need to probe that question further. What is it to live such a life? It's not just to choose randomly, it's to choose in accord with a conception of value and so on. So what I see at the heart of I see two things at the heart of human nature. One is a striving, a reaching out for truth, a reaching out for goodness and so on, which we recognize in one another, and this enables us to identify one another as members of the same moral species, if I could put it that way. But I think we also find in ourselves, and we find in one another, a kind of conflictedness that expresses itself universally, quite independently of culturally variant circumstances and so on. So what we're looking for now at this deeper level is an explanation of how it could be that we're beings of a sort that find ourselves directed towards the good and the true, but also beings of a sort that find ourselves apparently irresolvably conflicted both in our interior and between ourselves. Now, I think at that point, the story has to continue. You can't just stop at that point. And I think a religious foundation here of the sort that I've just sort of suggested doesn't turn at this point on the tenets of particular revelations. If you like, in that respect, it's a natural theological foundation. But the question then would be, to what extent is that picked up in particular faiths and traditions? And I think, by the way, that in this respect, there is a moral criterion of the adequacy of particular revelations and faiths, the extent to which they do or fail to conform with those ideals and values. So I don't think that every faith is to be respected. That's why, I'm not interested in a kind of sentimental universalism that accommodates faith as if it were some sort of trump card in every context. There are some faiths that are absolutely, abhorrent. There are some scriptures that are abhorrent, and one has to apply a test of reasonableness. But I think at the end of the day, the foundation of that reasonability rests beyond a confined natural human nature and points in the direction of a kind of supernatural order. That's the view.
Got it.
You say got it?
Just registering.
No, but you said got it, and you let him get from natural to supernatural without a word of transition.
So press the point.
Yeah. Well, what grounds do you have for thinking there's a supernatural dimension?
Well, the form of the argument was something like this. How are we to make sense of this, right? The sense of our status as moral beings that have these two aspects, as it were, that reaching out to value, but on the other hand seem in ways conflicted. Now, if you like, this seeks for a kind of anthropology, an account of what it is to be human. And I think we stand in need of a philosophical account, if you like, or an ethical account of what it is to be human, such that we can fill in things like the Golden Rule, so we know who falls within the scope of that. Now, I think that when we look around for such, the richest understanding of that comes from religious directions. That's the claim. It's not meant to be a deduction strictly of that. It's meant to be a question, if you like, of what provides the best account or explanation. And in the meantime, it also stands as a challenge to secular accounts that simply would treat these things as freestanding, as if they simply arise without explanation.
Religion becomes dangerous when private belief turns into public control. A person can believe whatever they want, but the moment that belief is pushed into schools, laws, and government policy, everyone else is forced to live under ideas they may not accept. Christianity has often done this by claiming moral authority over non-believers. The Bible itself says, unbelievers are condemned already in John 3:18, and Psalm 14:1 says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. That language does not create equal public ground. It divides people into saved, condemned, wise, and foolish. A fair society cannot be built on that kind of religious ranking.
But you're making a mystery where none exists. I mean, if you make the assumption that we are members of an evolved higher primate species, and then you look at us and think, why do they have wars? Why do they have sexual jealousy? Why do they have rape? You understand already. There's no mystery about it. Yeah. But also, why do they have families? Why do they have emotions? Why do they care for their children? Same question can be asked, is asked about chimpanzees and dolphins. There isn't a mystery. You're creating one where none exists. You're piling on supererogatory assumptions. But I was very glad to see you make the concession earlier that there isn't any necessary connection between faith and morality. I think that's a rather larger concession than I expected so soon from you, sir.
Well, that's why I've been fast. But look, the question is not whether or not we can't find sort of social pressures and features that have adaptive utility and so on that might contour certain patterns of human behavior. The question that's more interesting is our capacity to engage in the reflective questioning of those habits, those inclinations, and so on. So we might say that, look, we found that certain sort of thing has benefited us over the years, over the centuries, over the millennia. The question is, ought we to behave in that way? And the idea that certain things have just benefited, it doesn't, in and of itself, answer the question as to whether or not this is a good and noble and decent way to live. And it's that question, which I think is a pressing question which we feel, beyond, as it were, what nature has forced upon us. There's the question, how ought we to live? And that's a question that only moral beings can ask. And by moral beings, I mean beings that are not simply determined by those evolutionary and historical pressures.
I wouldn't say determined, but shall we at least say conditioned. And, by the way, not created. You talk as if we have a responsibility to a higher being, which we don't. When you say, since mammals do behave in this way, would you agree? That's the is bit. Then of course we can ask, ought they to? But isn't it, once you've made my assumption, a slightly odd question.
But look, it's our capacity.
Will they, what about a question like this? Do you think they will go on, we, our species, will go on making war, torturing each other, killing each other, raping each other, dissing each other and so on? I think you can probably, as a believer in original sin, I presume,
yes.
and make the assumption that they will. But I, without original sin, can tell you that that will happen.
Yeah. And the question, I suppose, would be why. But look, the point is, it's just
no,
that
there's no
ability.
Why. There's no why, there's no mystery.
But it is precisely that ability to reflect upon our condition that reveals us to be moral beings that transcend that mere evolutionary history. But look, that's going to be the point of contention.
Also, we're usurping sheriff's...
That's true.
Sorry.
In fact, yeah. The next question was for you, Mr. Hitchens.
Goody.
It's a clarification from some of your writings. So you've written that civil rights reformers like Martin Luther King were, despite appearances, not really religious, but secular. And that certain murderous tyrants like Stalin were, again, despite appearances, not secular, but religious. So what do you mean by that? And why isn't it just a case of calling anything you dislike religious and anything you like secular?
Right. Oh.
I didn't mean it to be an applause line, but
yeah, that was
I'll take it.
That was a rather easy clap, I must say. Well, anyone who's read Dr. Martin Luther King's speeches, or indeed his doctoral thesis, will know that he was a rather complicated Hegelian, that he, of course, didn't believe in the Exodus story, though that was the text he took, because the only place you could make a public speech if you were a black man in the South at that time was from the pulpit, and it was the only book everyone knew. But a moment's thought will tell you that the Exodus story would have entitled his oppressed tribe to kill and dispossess anyone else who got in their way. That's why we don't have any Amalekite problem anymore, or Moabite or Jebusite problem anymore. And in fact, Dr. King, fortunately for us, obviously didn't believe the Exodus story. He believed to the contrary, and a good thing too. So that's the first thing. And the American Anti-Slavery Society, when it was first begun, was decorated by wonderful non-believers like Thomas Paine and Benjamin Franklin, and it took the Christians, and even then, several more decades to catch up, to undo some of the harm that the Christian authority and warrant for slavery had done. And even then it went on in the South under the same warrant of the biblical separation of the races. The motto of the Confederacy, Deo Vindice, by the way, is the motto of the Confederacy, God on our side. The same slogan that appears in German on the belt buckle of every Nazi soldier, and the same words that appear in the oath everyone had to take to Hitler, I swear in the name of God, for the Führer. All of that can't be described, I think, as secular. With the Joseph Stalin question, I'll have to take just 30 seconds. It's a little more complicated. If you become the head of a Russian state that for several thousand years of serfdom and slavery and Jew baiting and war and feudalism has taught millions and millions of peasants that the head of the state is somewhere a little above the throne, a little below heaven, something supernatural. If you don't take advantage of that, you really shouldn't be in the dictatorship business. He had a ready-made audience of credulous believers. And what did he produce for them? An inquisition, a really ingenious inquisition, one of the greatest heresy hunts in history, miraculous harvests, all flowing from the dear leader, the biology of Lysenko. You can fill in the rest for yourself. And always at his side, invariably at his side, the Russian Orthodox Church, which to this day produces icons, painted ones, beautiful ones in some ways, ugly in others, showing his face with a halo around it. He never ever repudiated the allegiance of or was repudiated by the Orthodox Church of his country. If you want to call this secular, you're entitled. But don't try it again when I'm here.
Then one more question, and then we'll go to audience questions. Professor Haldane, there may be side worries about taking a kind of theistic public philosophy as the foundation, at least for our norms in civil society. I mean, for example, isn't it easier to fall into fanaticism if you think you're discharging some divine command as opposed to just following common sense secular ideas about the good of helping people and the bad of harming them?
Well, there's certainly recurrently a kind of fanaticism associated with absolutism. But I think two things about that. First of all, that is not the privilege or prerogative exclusively of the religious. And secondly, I think it's a consequence of a kind of fallacious inference. As I see it, I'd put it like this. Here's one way of raising the question. Who is the better friend of tolerance? The believer in absolute truth or the believer in relativism? Now, I'm inclined to say that the better friend of tolerance and toleration is the believer in absolute truth. And for the following reason. But we can see how this might also go wrong. The believer in absolute truth thinks there is something to be discovered. And if that person has any experience of serious inquiry, they will know that human beings are fallible in the effort to discover it. But they will recognize in others what they find in themselves, a desire to discover it. And so the ground, what that belief in absolute truth does in the human search for it, is grounds a respect for fellow inquirers and a recognition of the fallibility that we exhibit in our efforts to discover it. So there's a kind of toleration that comes from recognizing others as seekers after truth and the difficulty of discerning that truth. But what some absolutists about truth have done is transfer the attitude that is appropriate to the object of their inquiry, namely truth, and intolerance of error in that sense, of falsity and such like, to fellow seekers, and have become intolerant of fellow seekers. But not only is there nothing in the doctrine of absolute truth that requires that, there's something in it that seems to me to exclude it. On the other hand, the relativist is gently disposed towards difference and wants to perhaps respect and regard or be tolerant towards difference, but they may make the mistake of then transferring the attitude that is appropriate to the person, namely that of toleration, to the idea of truth itself. And so in losing the idea of a notion of absolute truth, they also lose the possibility of grounding a sense of value in that inquiry. So the claim I'd want to make is this, that intolerance is not a consequence of a belief in truth, a truth to be discovered. Intolerance is as equally, it can arise from people who have that view, but that's a mistake. And it's equally and increasingly more commonly to be discovered on the part of people who have no regard for truth.
Religion keeps trying to claim the moral high ground, but history and scripture make that claim hard to defend. Christianity did not clearly abolish slavery. Parts of the Bible regulated it, accepted it, and told slaves to obey their masters. Exodus 21:20-21 treats an enslaved person as property, while Ephesians 6:5 and Colossians 3:22 tell slaves to obey earthly masters. That matters because religious authority was later used to defend slavery, segregation, and racial hierarchy. When a moral system needs centuries of correction from outside pressure, science, law, and human rights, it cannot honestly call itself the source of morality.
Where is it coming from?
Go ahead. Were you going to add something?
Well, I'm not sure it's my turn, but...
Well, in principle it isn't, but
Right, yes.
I give you a turn.
Okay.
I just spent.
You appear to say that though, because if you had said that someone is more inclined to be tolerant if they possessed absolute truth, you would obviously have uttered a nonsense.
No, I wasn't saying that.
Because people who think they have the absolute truth, believe me, you don't need me to tell you, are capable of anything, including tremendous lying.
Yeah, but there's no point in repeating the
So
thing I didn't say, right?
instead of saying that, you seem to say that there exists somewhere a Platonic absolute truth, but it can't be attained by us, though we keep looking. How's that different from relativism?
Well, because, first of all, I didn't say Platonic, but what
I'm just saying
the idea...
You don't say well then, you, just to be sure, you don't say anyone has absolute truth or access to it, do you?
No, what I'm saying is this. The question was whether or not people who take a view about truth, let us say, or absolutism and so on, are intolerant in certain ways. My claim was this, that in fact a belief in objective truth combined with well, you can
absolute.
have all right. We'll have absolute in there. All right, a belief in absolute.
You can't
well, I mean,
climb down that fast.
That's fine. No, by absolute I mean non-relative truth. There really is some fact to the matter. That fact is not conditioned by or dependent upon human opinion. With regard to some matter, there is a truth that is autonomous and independent of us, and is as is, thus and so. Right. So absolute in that respect. Now, my point was this: that a person who believes in that, combined with two further thoughts common in the traditions, One is that we are interested in that, and that human inquiry is directed towards the discovery of that. Science is one example, ethics is another. There are lots of them, right? Areas in which we seek out truth of that kind. A person who believes in truth, believes in the value of seeking truth, and recognizes human fallibility in that effort, has a foundation for a kind of toleration in recognizing in fellow human beings, fellow seekers, respecting also the fact that they too are subject to the burdens that we are subject to in our efforts to try to understand and discover these matters, and that produces a kind of fellowship of common shared human understanding. Take away the notion of absolute truth, and all you have, as it were, is a fashion of the moment as to where it is that things tend to go at any given moment.
All right, well, look, I'd now be usurping as we would, the right of the audience to ask a question, but I'll just have to leave you with this. I mean, are you saying we'll know absolute truth when we find it? And I could make a statement of objective truth easily enough, and so can you. But can you make a statement of absolute truth while we wait to find what it is?
Well,
and how is that different from a relativistic, skeptical, open conversation?
Look, open conversation, skepticism, and relativism are three different things. But with regard to the question...
They're a trinity that partakes of one another, then.
I hope not. If the condition of the possibilities of an open conversation is you'd be a relativist or a skeptic, then that seems to me a mistake. But look, the point was simply this, that if you say, so give us an example of something that might be an absolute truth, then I do think, and maybe we share this actually, but on a different foundation, that something like human life, innocent human life, is something to be respected and not violated. Right? That seems to me to be the product.
That's a precept, not a truth.
Well, I'm not sure what you're taking that difference to be.
Well, innocent humans die in their millions every year for no reason than that they're born to a primate species on a very harsh planet.
Well, that's a description.
We can't say we dislike that.
No, that's a description of what might happen.
Well, we can say
mine
we
was a
dislike
claim about what we ought or ought not to do. But look, I mean,
that is not a statement. What you just made is in no sense a truth statement.
Others can judge that as well.
No sense a truth statement. Very well. It's your turn. Sorry, comrades.
On to the audience. Here's a truth. It's not a joke, although it might sound like it. The regulations of health and safety forbid the use of microphones on the upper level for fear of dropping a microphone on the head of someone on the lower level. So, hate to break it to you. So we will go with questions around here. Rosalind or Brian will bring you the microphone, and right there's our first one. Please stand.
Mr. Hitchens, I wouldn't call myself a fan of yours, but I am a devout YouTube follower, so it's a pleasure to actually hear you in person.
Thank you.
I want to challenge an assertion in your book, and you argue that one of the reasons why religion poisons everything is because it's abusive to children. Now, multiple studies have shown that in the U.S., religiously active youth are less likely to be depressed and commit suicide, and they're less likely to abuse drugs and alcohol. So my question would be, how could child abuse have an empirically verifiable effect on youth that is so positive?
Was the question, I'll just say, audible to everybody? Right. So I fear that you would do this. You give me the task of making your question not just audible but intelligible. The gentleman asks, or claims to know, that the more religious you are as a young person in the United States, the less likely you are to be depressed or alienated, and connects this, by what means I don't know, to the question of child abuse, which is a euphemism for torture, rape, and psychic destruction of children. Two things. First, it is said that Louis Farrakhan's Nation of Islam group gets black kids off drugs. I have no means of knowing whether this is or is not true. But let's grant that it might be true. It doesn't seem to have been established, but it doesn't alter the fact that the Nation of Islam is a racist crackpot organization, which anyone interested in mental health would be well advised to stay away from. It is said that the Mormon Church has a lower incidence of misery in family life and higher motivations. That might, for all I know, be true. But it doesn't alter the fact that Joseph Smith's fake religion is an outrageous imposture on human reason and dignity. It's a cult. It's a regrettable fact that some people do better in cults because they're so weak-minded and cowardly that they need the support of a pseudo-family. This says absolutely nothing at all about the value of religion, let alone its validity morally or philosophically. I hope that's clear. Since you've brought up the question of the rape and torture and psychic destruction of the lives of children, I suppose I will just do this.
I thought this might come up.
It's awkward because I know my vis-a-vis, Dr. Haldane, is a practicing Roman Catholic. But it does seem to me that after what we've learned about what the Roman Church has done to the children entrusted to its care, that I don't know of a single case, I've studied quite a lot of them, Australia, the United States, Ireland, France, Austria, Germany, Italy, and this is by no means an exhausted list, that there is no case where those children wouldn't have been better off if the secular courts had had the ordering of it, instead of private, secret religious courts that were interested not in what you call, rightly, the inviolability of the innocent, a precept, not a truth, but a precept that you invoked, but were instead concerned only with the silencing of the victims, the exculpation of the criminals, the covering up of the crime, and the continuing exculpation, cover-up, and blackmail of the victims, now practiced by the very head of this church himself, a man who his followers believe to be the vicar of Christ on earth. I ask you, who can think of this as other than a grotesque parody of even the most elementary principles of decency, ones which we don't have to be taught? Who doesn't know that the rape and torture and desecration of children is wicked, is an iniquity?
The easiest way to test religion is to look at what happens when it gets power over children. The record is ugly. Public investigations in Ireland, Australia, the United States, and other countries found that religious institutions protected their own image while children were abused, silenced, and ignored. Australia's Royal Commission documented widespread failures by religious institutions in responding to child sexual abuse. Ireland's Ryan Report investigated abuse in institutions responsible for children and issued formal recommendations after years of testimony. The point is brutal but simple. If a church claims to teach moral truth, then hides abuse from secular justice, it has no right to lecture anyone about good and evil.
And how I'm never going to be told again by the Roman Catholic Church that I wouldn't know good from evil if it wasn't for them. I'm sorry. I'm never going to hear that again. Good.
In the front row there. Yep.
Okay, thanks for your talk. I don't think it's particularly productive to discuss what the substantive truth of, for instance, any one religion is, because obviously we can get into sort of hermeneutic debates and endlessly debate it.
Can you give it some welly?
Yeah. Stand up and slow down.
Yeah. So, okay, I'm not particularly interested in debating the substantive content of a religious faith, Islam, Christianity, or Judaism, but someone who actually grew up in Iran, has experienced theocratic dictatorship and the yoke of sort of the particular curse of the religious state. I could say that I don't really need to get into sort of a long-winded debate to decide which sort of state I would prefer to live under. It's more of a statement, to be honest. We don't really, just looking at the results of that state and sort of the horror it's reaped on that country, I don't think we need to sort of, to look any further to the results of, living under the sort of religious tyranny.
Well, good for you.
Well, let me briefly turn
well
that
said.
into a question for Professor Haldane. Professor Haldane, how is your view distinct from, or at least why doesn't your view lead down the road of a theocracy?
Well, look, a theocracy is a claim about the authority of a church or some religious structure to govern something like a state or to have jurisdiction over a population out with the sphere of its liturgical and other practices, for example, that it would make law more generally. I don't see any connection. Well, there's two thoughts about this. I mean, one is I see no connection between the things I have said and the idea that theocracy might in some way be a good thing. Secondly, the history of these things teaches us, even those of us who inhabit these religious spaces, that theocracies have proven to be a bad thing. But thirdly, one of the ways in which they've proven to be bad is that they're injurious to the religions themselves, that they actually corrupt the religious values themselves by bestowing upon the occupants of religious offices ambitions that are quite beyond that of proper spiritual care and what is the sphere of their competence.
Absolutely.
So I don't think that this is an issue as well, or let's put it this way, a religious believer who's interested in a theocracy seems to me as somebody who's more likely to be interested in power than they are in religious values.
Bravo. My point.
Our point.
Very good.
Is this distasteful to you?
Well done.
Too much agreement?
We're not allowed to agree, right?
No.
Go ahead.
Bring it
Hi.
on.
I have a question about religious pluralism. So,
Listen, I'm sorry, we're having difficulty up here, I think, hearing the questions. Could you just go, I don't know about others, but if you could just go slightly slower, please, and
Yes,
then we'll
please.
hear them, I think. Sorry, is that all right?
I have a question about religious pluralism. Mr. Hitchens spoke about religious pluralism sort of as secularism, and I first wanted to contest that conflation and talk about religious pluralism as something that's not a reality of religious diversity and plurality, but sort of a state of sort of a positive definition of what we do with the reality of that diversity. So I wanted to ask what your vision of religious pluralism is, acknowledging religious plurality in a world where religion is in or is out of the public sphere.
I'm sorry, I missed it. In a world in which...
Well, one of you is clearly arguing for religion to be part of the public sphere, and one is arguing for religion to be out of the public sphere. So what does religious pluralism look like to you in each of these situations? And not just not pluralism conflated with plurality or secularism.
Can I just start with a shot at that, and then you can see how we're coming in?
Yes.
I mean, supposing maybe this will help, I don't know. Supposing somebody said, what is your view of, say, aesthetic pluralism? The idea that out there are people who, some of whom take principal pleasure from, say, music, others from literature, others from the visual arts, plastic arts, and so on. And then within each of those, there are some who have these preferences in romantic, classical, and such like. I think the natural response to that would be that each of these answers to a certain appetite or a dimension or an aspect of the human condition and human sensibility and such like. Now, it seems to me to some extent, this is true of religions as well. That is to say, there are aspects of human nature that tend in the direction of the ascetic, the spare, the restricted, the disciplined, and so on. And, Quakers in one direction, certain kinds of Free Presbyterians in another, and so on. And you could find outside Christian traditions these. And there are others that go for a certain richness, a liturgical complexity, ritual and such like, sacramentalism, a great theological complexity. Now, to some extent, it seems to me that is a reflection of different aspects of human sensibility. I don't think that in the sphere of religion, any more than the sphere of the aesthetic, one could, as it were, set out some unitary mode of religious expression that could satisfy all aspects of, as well, human sensibility and human condition. So it seems to me religious pluralism, in one sense of it, is precisely what one would expect to find, given the complexity of human psyche and sensibility and so on. Now, there's a different question, of course, about religious pluralism. One, as well, a theoretical one, is there some difficulty for religion reconciling these differences? And there's a political question or a practical question, how are they to rub up together? And Christopher Hitchens is quite rightly often pointed to their inability to rub up to effectively coexist. I think the explanation for that, by the way, is a very deep, common one, which is that human beings have difficulty inhabiting the same space. They compete for that space. And this is a general question, independently of whether you're religious or not, finding a foundation in which, a basis on which people can inhabit common space. Now, that's part of what we were discussing tonight, but these are very large and complex questions.
I think I was the one who she misunderstood the most, even so. And it's my fault, I dare say. But let me clarify it. there was established during the McCarthy period in the United States by Billy Graham and various other right-wing evangelicals, a panic resolution in Congress establishing a National Day of Prayer. National Day of Prayer. It was last week. An organization with which I'm associated, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, secured a judgment from a judge in Madison, Wisconsin, which will now, I think, be heard by the Supreme Court, saying that that National Day of Prayer is unconstitutional. Americans can pray any time they like, but the government can't tell them to do so. Pretty simple proposition, you'd think. It takes forever to hammer this principle into people's heads. One way to do it is to say, all right, from tomorrow, all school children in America will have to pray. Billy Grahamites brighten up, say, but it'll be Hindu prayer. They say, we didn't mean that. We didn't say you didn't. Oh, or do you mean that what you said you wanted was a national day of Christian prayer? Or just Protestant Christian prayer, to be exact? Because otherwise we can say they'll all have to say Hail Mary in school, and surely that'll be just as good for their moral education. Or they'll all have to go to shul, or they'll all have to make the Muslim profession of faith. Surely any of these are better than secularism or atheism. They don't get it. What they don't understand is it's only people like myself, the secular forces, who say the government has no business here, who guarantee that they won't be oppressed by another religion. And it's, in other words, there is only one way in which any society has ever guaranteed religious freedom, and it's by a wall of separation between church and state. I really don't think that penny should have taken so long to drop, if I may say so.
Religion shows its weakness the moment it needs the government to promote it. Prayer, commandments, and religious language do not become more moral because a state stamps them with authority. They become coercion. That is why the United States Supreme Court ruled in Engel versus Vitale that government-written prayer in public schools violates the First Amendment, even when students can opt out. The problem is pressure. A child should not have to choose between fitting in and rejecting a prayer they do not believe. Real freedom means the government stays out of religion completely. Faith that needs state power is already admitting it cannot stand on its own.
Rosalind, could we get that gentleman right here? Yeah?
Cool. Thanks very much for a fascinating debate. I have a question for Mr. Hitchens. Mr. Hitchens, you seem to have been seeing yourself as debating with an audience the sort of to whom the book, The God Delusion, is directed, whereas Professor Haldane seems to have been speaking more within the context of the last 300 years of moral and political philosophy. In particular, people like John Rawls and Bernard Williams and Simon Blackburn. And so I want to get back to the question, which I think was the first that Professor Haldane asked, and which is specifically mentioned in the synopsis of this talk, which is, do you think, do you accept that the only way that you as a secularist can ground your normative conception of the person is simply to say, well, it's in my intuition as an evolved being, and if you don't share that intuition, then there's not much I can do to persuade you?
Did you say intuition?
Yeah.
Well, you've already earned your applause. I think it came too soon. Be careful about that. I simply don't share the grammar of your question. The feeling that I have of being an evolved member of a primate species is, excuse me, not an intuition.
Hold on, so I think that wasn't my question at all. The question is, okay,
well,
right,
you might have left that bit out there.
We are all evolved members of the primate species. I accept that entirely. Now, having accepted that,
yes,
and living in a society where lots of us don't share religious intuitions, and you as a secularist, when it comes to debating within society and using reasons in public debate, what reason do you have when you're arguing in favor of things like fundamental human rights? What reason do you have to ground those rights and normative conceptions of the person?
Well, first, I'm not taking a secularist position. I'm an atheist and anti-theist. the main common ground I have with Dr. Haldane is if I was a believer, I would still be for the separation of church and state for the excellently phrased reason that he gave. Remember how Dante says, I see the Pope is still fornicating with the emperor. That it isn't just that I don't want the society or the state religionized, but if I was a believer, I wouldn't want it corrupted by association with state power. In other words, the worst moment comes when the Emperor Constantine says, this is now the official religion of my empire. That's a terrible thing. And we have parodic subversions of that, like the absurd appearance of that sheep-faced loon, Rowan Williams, in the House of Lords. You know, a place which he's no right to legislate just because he's a bishop. But that I would say if I was an Anglican. When you said, what's my grounding? How do I know there are such things as human rights? I don't. I don't know there are such things. I have a very strong suspicion that Bentham might have been right about that. That they're certainly not from God, because if they were, a few more people would have them, or have had them. The concept is only a few hundred years old. It had to be wrung out of the bogus concept that there was a right, but that it was a divine right and only for kings. It's an attempt to negate and spread that, made by Thomas Paine. My strong suspicion is also you don't get the rights you don't fight for. So that's my grounding. I think our position there is about as tenuous as our position as a primate species on a rather dodgy planet.
All right, do we have
unsupervised?
The microphone up there.
Yes, Mr. Hitchens.
Sir.
From Virginia, I'm pleased to actually express appreciation of separation of church and state, like you mentioned.
Thank you.
I also can recognize the problems of having beliefs forced on you. I also can recognize the depraved human condition that we lived in. I also can look at the issue that you might say of no responsibility to a higher being. I would also agree to your accurate criticisms of man-made religion.
There's a but lurking here somewhere.
Yes, sir.
Surely not.
I can also agree.
Just try to speed up to the question and the but.
I'm for giving butts time.
Right, yes. And one of the issues I noticed, though, is that you are able to, at times it appears, the intent and the content of some of your criticisms are very heartfelt in disappointment with the concept of benevolence. Of a sense of life as a gift, right. And the sense of present as being a present. And what I ask you is, some of that criticism seems to be beyond the capacity of a primate. And so I ask you, as a not religious person, but as a Christian, that
it's come
yes,
to that.
Yes. One who disdains the ignorance of man-made religion because of the thousands of years of outcomes of it. I ask you, where in the world is that source coming from that is actually able to articulate the concept of one who is disappointed and standing in the position of an anti-theist? Because I would say perhaps that source might be inspired.
Yeah. It got less good as it went along, I think. I started very promisingly. Well, and by the way, I knew this would happen, and you must see it a lot. You know, I'm not religious at all. I'm just a Christian. I think, is it not George? Is it not? It's like being an Anglican. Is it not George Herbert, the great poet of Anglicanism, who speaks of the sweet mediocrity of our native church? It commits you to nothing. Actually, my impression of Christianity is that you are a Christian if you believe that God gave a son for the redemption of our sins and allowed him to become a human sacrifice as the seal of that pact. If you don't believe something like that, that a human sacrifice commits you even if you didn't want it to happen, I don't really think you can say you're a Christian. You ask me what I think the source is, and where you almost seem to ask, where does my divine spark come from? Well, sweetie, I don't know, but I don't mind not knowing. I look forward to discovering further frontiers of my ignorance. Socrates was never wiser than when he said the definition of the educated is the one who has some idea of how little he knows. And the more education you get, and the older, I warn you, you get, the more you'll find out that you know more and more about less and less and less, and more things. And it's wonderful. It's a tremendous experiment in learning. So I'm quite happy to say I don't know, but the believer has to say that they do know. They can't hedge this. If it be not true, as St. Paul says.
Try asking one simple question. Who actually gave people rights? It was not priests. It was not kings. It was not church councils. For most of history, religious power stood beside political power and told ordinary people to obey. Romans 13:1 even says governing authorities are established by God, which made rebellion against rulers look like rebellion against heaven. Modern rights came from pressure. People protested, organized, wrote, fought, and forced governments to recognize them. That is why religion's claim to human dignity falls apart. If rights came from God, they should have protected people from the beginning. Instead, people had to win them against the systems that claimed God was on their side. So that leaves us with the real question. If rights had to be fought for, challenged, and forced into law, can religion honestly claim to be the source of human dignity? Comment your thoughts below. Do you think morality needs God? Or can human beings build justice without religion? And before you go, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more debates, commentary, and breakdowns like this.